Earliest childhood memories. Now, 75 years later, some of the earliest memories are just brief fragments. I barely remember two events that must have taken place in Rome, Georgia, the city of my February 8th, 1949 birth. The most ancient account was observing a flooded basement. I can't remember if I actually touched the water with my hand or with handheld assistance waded into the depths. A second memory happened shortly after I learned to walk. I wanted to join siblings in the backyard. My adventuresome self thought, there's no reason not to walk down the number of steps that led to the yard. This must have been my first attempt at negotiating a flight of stairs. I do remember stepping down one step and another, then a sense of floating for a moment as my feet miscalculated the exact trajectory required to descend. Following the ecstasy of floating and immediate fear came the reality of falling down the remainder of the steps. Only a couple of more very early story fragments, including turning sideways in my crib and pushing on the side rails with my feet with all of my might. One of the vertical slats snapped right in two, and Mom lowered the boom on my destructive behavior. The resulting space made it possible for me to escape the crib at my leisure. Sometime later, there was a large apple crate kind of a box in the yard, and for some reason, Brother George was using a hatchet on the thin boards. During the confusion of my crawling into the crate, I ended up getting mildly hit in the head with the hatchet. I remember some blood and crying, but apparently it was not a fatal blow. After that, like the 400-year space between the Old and the New Testaments, it was a while before I began retaining significant personal memories. 2 or 3 years later, we moved to Montgomery, Alabama, where Dad accepted an optical position with Ellis Optical Dispensary. We lived on Pine Street, just across from Jackson Hospital, and catty-cornered from Oak Park, which later became a focal point for racial integration in the city. I believe that was the house where Ellen Hay visited and invited us to Oak Park Presbyterian Church on Mulberry Street. I remember being uncomfortably dropped off in the children's Sunday school room while Mom went off to sing in the choir. Tears were shed as my first identity as an introvert began to emerge. I attended that church until I finished high school. A couple of my brothers sang in the choir. I later joined when Johnny Long was the choir director. I was quite young and not sure I had much of a changed voice yet, and I was short enough that my robe had to be shortened over a foot. Meanwhile, around age 3, we moved into a frame house on Winona Avenue, not far from Capitol Heights Junior High. We were in walking distance to Yancey Park. I remember being so concerned that Dad wouldn't know where to find us after work since we had moved during the day. Somehow, not long after 5 p.m., he arrived, bounding up our front steps. I was amazed how smart he was. There was a man who lived behind us in an apartment who had suffered polio and was in an iron lung. That was something to behold for a little guy. The family in the adjacent lot had a nice brick house, and the husband had a large backyard pond in which he raised some very large goldfish. We lived there long enough that I became aware of Superman and his ability to fly. Boy, was I thrilled when I received my first Superman cape. It was a towel that sported a hand-painted S. There were no instructions with the cape, And how was I to know I couldn't really fly when wearing the semi-official Superman cape? I took a proverbial leap off the short hill just above the sidewalk. I went soaring for about 2 feet, then crashed down on the sidewalk face first. A faulty cape, I suppose. Many years later, my mother would laugh about the story when I would take her purse, fill it with our old mail, and throw it over my shoulder and deliver the mail to each house on the block. She said I stopped at a few houses down the block and knocked on the door, and after a delay I shouted, "Open the door! I know you're in there. I can hear you rattling the pans." 4, yea, 5 final fragments, including riding my tricycle down the block, turning left at the corner and riding up the hill on the side street from Winona. I turned around to head back home, and after 3 or 4 turns of the trike pedals, gravity and speed took total control of the vehicle, and I was sailing down the hill at Mach speed, with my feet having no idea where the pedals had gone. Fortunately, I have no recall of an actual crash, but I remember the feeling of fear having zero control over my wheels. Barefoot was the dress code of the day for children in the Deep South. I was walking through a neighbor's grass when my bare foot stepped right on a bee. I was immediately overcome with a quickly rising sharp pain, which grew intensely through my siren screams all the way home. Apparently, I was pretty independently mobile in those days. I was walking down the sidewalk on Winona, headed home, and stretched completely across the path was Lassie. It seemed such a simple thing to simply step right over the dog and continue my journey home. As I began to negotiate the jump, that beautiful dog decided to bark loudly and reach up to bite me. I don't know if an angel lifted me out of reach or if the pooch simply missed the bite, but yet another moment of brief panic was experienced and tragedy averted. One Sunday, the family returned from church, and as we moved toward the house, we noticed a number of blimps in the sky right over our house. I was terrified, as I thought they were huge bombs, that they were about to fall, explode, and terminate our existence. Someone tried to assure me we were safe, and they were not bombs. Apparently, they were right. The final fragment of fear happened on the perimeter of Yancey Park. I believe George was playing with some friends on the ball field, and I wandered down toward the corner of the grounds. The corner was grassless red clay and relatively steep for a 4 or 5-year-old. Across the corner was a lady waiting on the bus. I believe she was a maid for one of the neighborhood families, but I didn't know her. For some reason, she began to gather her belongings and stepped toward me, saying, "I'm going to get you, boy." I was terrified and began to scamper up the clay hill. I must have looked like a cartoon character, with my feet and hands flailing, gaining no traction, and sliding back toward my attacker. Of course, the lady was teasing me, much in the same manner that the butcher was at the local market when he picked me up and headed for the butcher block to carve me into steaks and roasts. Somehow, I survived those traumatic years.